So whether you've taken a multitude of science courses or you've taken the minimum number of science courses, you've probably heard of photosynthesis before, or at least familiar with the idea that plants need energy from the sun and that they take in carbon dioxide and water and produce oxygen and sugars as a result. Well, what you may remember, or what you might not know, is that there's a complementary process to this that we call cellular respiration. Now, cellular respiration is the process that all cells derive energy from, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a single-celled organism or all of the cells in a complex organism like us. They go through the process of cellular respiration, and as a result, require oxygen for that process and give off carbon dioxide. Now, regardless of that size, there are several properties that all organisms have to have for this process of what we call respiration. That is, at this respiratory surface, it has to be moist and it has to be thin-walled. And as we get more complex, there are some other factors that have to come into play too. There has to be some means of transporting either to or from the respiratory surface, whether we're talking about the carbon dioxide waste or the oxygen gas that has to get in. There has to be a large surface area, especially as the organism starts to get larger and more complex. We have to maximize the amount of surface area available so that we can maximize the amount of oxygen being taken in, and we can maximize the amount of carbon dioxide waste being given off. And finally, there has to be a way, especially when we get to the large, more complex organisms like us, for us to bring the air in contact with that respiratory surface, especially if it's internal. So we're going to take a look at all of that and more as we take a look at our own respiratory system. But just like with the digestive system, I asked you to go get something to eat. While we go through our respiratory system, I want you to take a deep breath. Heck, take two. And I want you to think about how that feels and what you sense as you take the deep breath and as we describe the structures. And if you take a deep breath, you're either going to take it in through your mouth or you're going to take it in through your nose. And both of those are entryways into the respiratory system. Now, as air moves through those, the air gets warmed and moistened. Ultimately, when we get down to the respiratory surface, it's a very delicate surface. So we want to make sure that the air that gets down there is as warm and as moist as possible, and that we have filtered out any potential irritants that there might be in there, be it dust or viruses or bacteria or something that could get in and damage the delicate respiratory surface. So in your nose, you have hair and mucus that act to trap any particles or bacteria or foreign matter that could get in and potentially damage the respiratory surface. As we move from our nasal cavity or our oral cavity into the back, into the pharynx, where the two passages meet, we then move in through the glottis, which is the opening to the trachea. Now, normally, we have an opening into the trachea that's open, and the mechanism of swallowing, as we discussed in the digestive system, the epiglottis closes over that. But for the most part, unless we're swallowing, that passageway stays open. Now, as we move through the glottis into the windpipe proper, we're going to pass the larynx, which is better known as the voice box, and is the thing that I'm using right now to describe the voice box to you. And we're going to keep going and move into the trachea. Now, the trachea is always open. It's lined with cartilaginous rings that prevent it from collapsing. And it's also lined with cilia, or little hairs and mucus, that are going to further act to filter and warm the air, but also trap any dust particles or viruses, or again, anything that's going to potentially damage the delicate respiratory surface. These cilia move or beat up towards the throat, and usually this excess mucus gets swallowed, or if there is a lot of it, such as in the case when we're sick or have some other respiratory ailment, we're going to cough or sneeze it out. Now, from the trachea, we move into two branches, one to the right lung and one to the left. These are what we call bronchi. The bronchi further branch into little bronchioles, and then ultimately we reach the terminal end, or the very end, of the respiratory surface where the actual gas exchange takes place, or at least the first type of gas exchange takes place, and we refer to those as the alveoli. Now, the alveoli tick a lot of boxes for a respiratory surface. They're thin, some as thin as 1 cell thick, and they are moist. They're lined with a fluid that contains something called a surfactant. So effectively, a surfactant is just something that breaks the surface tension of water. When your alveoli are inactive or not being used, you're not using all of your lung capacity all of the time, it would be very difficult for them to separate due to the sort of attractive forces of water. So this surfactant acts kind of like a soap in that it breaks the surface tension of the water and allows the alveoli to open a lot more easily when we take in a deep breath. Now, because the alveoli are lined in fluid, it allows the easy diffusion of oxygen into the adjacent bloodstreams of the capillaries that are around them, and carbon dioxide out of those same capillaries and into the alveolar space. This is what we refer to as external respiration. The idea that we have oxygen from the external environment, which is kind of weird even though it's inside your body, inside the lungs, it's still considered the external environment, to diffuse into the fluids of the surrounding capillaries, and carbon dioxide to diffuse out. Now, diffusion is just the movement of a substance from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Sometimes this occurs across a membrane as well, something that allows substances in and out. Now, when we think about diffusion in the respiratory system, the blood that travels to the lungs from the rest of the body is high in carbon dioxide and relatively low in oxygen. The air that comes in is relatively high in oxygen and relatively low in carbon dioxide. So as a result, when the air comes in contact with the respiratory surface and the fluids that are surrounding the alveoli, the high concentration carbon dioxide moves from the blood to the low concentration air of the alveoli. On the other side, the high oxygen concentration in the air diffuses into the low oxygen concentration blood. So in addition to the lungs being thin-walled and moist to allow diffusion to occur readily, they also have a very large surface area. If we were to take a look at all of the different terminal ends, all of those little alveolar sacs, and open them up and spread them out for their surface area, they would approximately cover the size of a tennis court. And I know you might be saying, well, didn't we say the same thing about villi in the small intestines? And yeah, this is now two comparisons we make to surface area in a tennis court. I don't know if that was on purpose, the way that tennis courts were designed, but I guess you'd have to ask John Tennis. So respiration technically is at the site of gas exchange. And for us, again, the site of gas exchange is the alveoli. They're thin-walled, they are highly vascularized, they're moist, and they have a large surface area. So they tick almost all of those boxes. But the one thing that we have to consider, and we've already kind of discussed, is how we get the air to that respiratory surface. And when we think about respiration, most of the time we associate respiration with breathing. Now, breathing technically is not respiration, although in everyday vernacular, when you and I say respiration, almost everybody would associate that with breathing. But breathing itself is the act of taking the air, or more specifically the oxygen in the air, from the external environment to the respiratory surface in the alveoli, exchanging it for carbon dioxide, and then expelling this carbon dioxide into the external environment outside of the body. And again, this is where I want you to take a deep breath to try and think about what's actually going on during this mechanism. So go ahead, take a deep breath. And what we're going to see is we feel our chest rise. So these external intercostal muscles, which are the muscles that exist between the ribs, are contracting and they draw your rib cage up. At the same time, you have a muscular layer right here called the diaphragm, which separates your thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity. It's going to contract too, and it's going to drop down into your abdominal cavity. What happens is it increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. Now, there's an understanding or relationship with gases, in which volume and pressure of a gas are inversely related, meaning as one goes up, the other one goes down. So as we increase the volume of something, the pressure of that gas decreases. Conversely, if we decrease the volume of something, the pressure of that gas increases. Now in the lungs, as we've increased the volume of that thoracic cavity, the pressure inside the lungs goes down. The pressure inside the lungs is now less than the pressure outside in the surrounding environment, so air rushes in from an area of high pressure to low pressure. Think about blowing into a balloon and the balloon having all of that air escape, going from an area of high pressure inside the balloon to an area of low pressure outside the balloon. Conversely, if we want to exhale or breathe out, we are going to feel the rib cage relax as those external intercostal muscles relax. It's going to lower. We are going to have our diaphragm relax, and the diaphragm moves back up into the thoracic cavity. The volume of that thoracic cavity in the lungs decreases. The pressure is now greater inside the lungs than it is outside the lungs, and we exhale or breathe out. So now hopefully you understand that biology, when we talk about respiration, specifically we're referring to cellular respiration. And when we talk about breathing, we're referring to a process probably more accurately known as ventilation, which is how we get the air from the external environment to the respiratory surface. And hopefully you understand that for a gas exchange surface to be effective, it has to be thin-walled and it has to be moist. And the more complex those organisms are, there should be a transport system in place and there should be a relatively large surface area. So breathe easy, and thanks for watching.